Hello, um, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. A very warm welcome to this ninth HoliCare webinar that is about artificial intelligence and digital health tools in clinical research and point-of-care diagnostics in no-resource settings. This afternoon, we have a tight program with three speakers, whom I will introduce. But first of all, my name is Johnblack Kabukye, and I am a medical doctor and a health informatics researcher at Stockholm University, here where I'm joining from. And we have speakers from other parts of the world. And we will be talking about HoliCare briefly as the program under which this webinar is organized there. And HoliCare is a collaboration between several institutions, several research entities, several diagnostic manufacturers and biomedical researchers. And it's working on developing innovative point-of-care diagnostics for respiratory tract infections in low and middle-income countries. And these innovations are multiplex lateral flow assays, which are quite simple and can be used without lab infrastructure. We're also working on LAMP, or isothermal loop-mediated amplification of DNA, for when you need some specific diagnostics. And we're also trying to put these innovations in a miniaturized lab, or what we call a lab on disk, using microfluidics innovations, and you can see some of those innovations being displayed there. You see a QR code which can take you to the HoliCare website, where you can find a lot of information about this. And one of the things that we're also doing is to have connected diagnostics. And connected diagnostics helps to quickly move information around using digital innovations such as artificial intelligence and mobile apps. And that will be the topic of the discussion today. And as I said, HoliCare is a huge consortium of 14 collaborators, and here you can see who they are. And today we are hosting at Stockholm University and Spider, and we have contributions from within HoliCare and from elsewhere. So again, warm welcome, and I hope that you are excited if you have. All right, so we'll go on to the program today, and we have these three amazing speakers. They will speak for about 15 minutes, and you can, of course, raise you can put your question and can be answered by either of them. But to begin with, we will have Luke Shankland, who will start the discussion, and he is the CEO and founder of Aviro Health, which is in South Africa, a digital health company that is trying to improve accessibility and delivery of health innovations. He's worked for over 20 years in leadership, working with organizations such as MSF, and with Aviro Health, they have built a program called Pocket Clinic that allows different patients to have access to healthcare services, reaching over 100,000 patients. And now I'll ask Luke to start his presentation about the innovation they're doing, and after that, we will have the other speakers introduced as well. Luke, over to you. If you can unmute yourself.
Great. Thanks, Johnblack. Good. Hopefully that's coming through now.
Yes.
Lovely. Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. And great to be here, and pleasure to sort of meet you all. What I wanted to do today is kind of really just table setting and quite a zoom out, which is just to remind ourselves about why. I mean, why do we want or need AI and digital solutions for point of care diagnostics? You know, why are we going to put these in place? Why and how do we need to empower patients and providers at the front line who are using these tools? What data do we need to collect? How do we need to share it? What insights do we need? So Yeah, I think I've got 10, 15 minutes. I'm going to go quite quickly through it, but just as again, as a reminder of what it is that we're trying to achieve here. I've also been asked to speak specifically about AI, so I will, and maybe I'll kick off there because it is 2026, and AI is very important, and everyone has an opinion, but I'll just give mine, which is that we are going to be using AI. Everyone will. It's a fantastic way to process data much faster and quicker, to share data, to move digital solutions around. Africa is going to struggle to compete. I think the numbers, $2 trillion were spent in total GDP across sub-Saharan Africa last year, and 8 firms in the US are going to spend about a third of that amount next year just developing AI tools. So what does that mean? It means that, bluntly, I think we're not really in the race. The Americans and the Chinese are in a race, and AI for Africans, we're probably going to be buying and renting these tools for the next 30 years. And that's the way it is. Now, when you're in the sort of current geopolitical environment, if that's the way it's going to be, we're going to have to think about what we're going to trade for. And we can say, oh well, it should be open source, or it's fairness or whatever else, but I just don't know that that's exactly how people negotiate anymore. And good luck trying to threaten the US or China to get something you want. So I think we need to think about positive leverage. What can we build as Africans? What can we trade? If we're going to be spending taxpayer dollars and health dollars and our own money on buying and renting tools that are going to be owned by the Americans or other people, what are we going to make with those tools that allows us to trade and get it on good terms, let's say. So let me set that aside and come back to that because I want to kind of close out with that. But let's just remind ourselves about how diagnostics work, right? And some of the challenges. So for a long time, most diagnostics was done centrally in labs. And we see problems with that. And some of those problems are addressable, and some of them are surely addressable, but are bigger, different kind of problems. At least they're not going to talk about today. Financing gaps, political will for change in health systems, health worker shortages. I'm currently sitting in Canada, and there's 6 million Canadians that don't have a primary health care physician. So these are global issues, and a lot of people are struggling with diagnostics. One of the big trends that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years is at least one of the problems we can solve is long lab turnaround times, right? So when you have blood samples that have to go to Johannesburg or Nairobi or Ottawa, or patients have to go there in order to get diagnostics done, then you lose a lot of patients, right? And you have a lot of problems. So one of the things we can do is move from the central lab to the point of care, to the clinic, to the pharmacy, even into the home. Of course, I think that really does help with turnaround times and patient retention and loss to follow-up. It still has problems. It doesn't change the problems around health worker shortages, political will, and financing gaps. And in some ways, it can exacerbate some of those problems. So think about health worker shortages, right? If we're going to move diagnostic testing to the point of care, it sounds great, but if we're already short on doctors and nurses, now we're asking them to also do lab tech work, right? And this is not necessarily what they're trained to do. So how do we know that that they know that the machines are working, that they're calibrated, that they know how to interpret the results properly? How do we get all the reporting? If everything has been done in a central lab, it's very convenient in terms of epidemiological reporting and tracking and all these other things we want to do because all the data is being collected in one place, and you have to train a few people who are lab technicians on how to enter that data in. Now it's going to be all over the place. People are doing this. So how do we make sure that we're having good surveillance, epidemiological reporting, and all the information that we need to be able to do policy work? And again, now we're moving the lab to the point of care. Great. But now we're asking overstretched health workers to do even more work. And they also have to now explain to the patients what do the lab results mean, how do things work, and things that would maybe have been done by a central lab, or how do we at least facilitate those things? And I point to these 3 issues because these are issues that really are communication issues. They're data issues. They are issues that AI and digital systems really can solve, right? So again, just to put it in big buckets, because that's the way I tend to think and like to think, what are we trying to achieve and what are we trying to solve when we talk about digital and AI solutions for the point of care and point of care diagnostics, right? So fleet management, quality control, how do we make sure that the machines are working, that they're calibrated, that we know that they're being used properly, that they're all those sort of issues. Then there's the actual reporting and data things. How do we make sure that we're getting all that data out and making it really easy for that to go to the government, to go to researchers, to go to regulators who are checking and making sure that these machines are working? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't just add more and more and more burden to health workers that are already very busy? And similarly, how do we help the health workers themselves and their patients to understand what's coming out of these results, right? How can we make it easier when it's borderline cases? They may not have been a lab tech. They may have been used to sending it out and they get the results back. And now, they know what to do with that, but that's different than having to interpret it and look through it in different ways. So the key here is how do we, in each of these sort of buckets, how do we make sure and how do we introduce digital tools that can facilitate all these things and take away some of these challenges of point of care diagnostics? Because point of care diagnostics really are better for the patient, for accessibility, for driving it. And we know that, which is why we're trying to push these things forward. So to bring it back to the African context, I'm not saying that these are the only solutions, but these are probably, as far as I know, the sort of primary solutions that are addressing, or at least, leading organizations that are addressing each of these different areas of challenges in digital and AI for point of care diagnostics. This is just a point to it. I think there's a couple things that I would point to here. One is that none of them are African organizations. And two, for those who have worked with these, they don't necessarily work all that well together. Now, I'm not saying that they're not interested in doing that. They are all committed to FHIR standards and interoperability and making sure that data can move between them. But if you've ever tried to set it up, you know that trying to set up a ComCare and a REDCap, or trying to set up between DHS2 and some of these systems can be quite a bit of work and a challenge. And I think it's important, and I think these are great solutions for many things. But because of those things about not being African and the challenges of interoperability is why we started Pocket Clinic and Aviro. We wanted a system that was really built to manage all of those parts together so that you could see how the machines are working, you could communicate with patients, you could do decision support for the frontline workers and have great high quality reporting coming out of that whole system. And we're very committed to human-centered design and the realities of Africa. So making sure that it can be done offline, multiple languages, and easy to use. So just to point out as well, like, easy to use, covering all of the sort of needs that we have around point of care diagnostics, and really covering the whole chain as well, all the way from sort of like, how do you hear about a test or diagnostic or a screening that you need to do? How do you make sure that you're linked to that care, whether you're testing at home or in a community or at a facility or with a person or a self-test or other things like that, and then make sure that linkage is happening and that high quality data is coming through this whole process so that when you're running a diagnostics program, you're able to see data coming through all the time that's telling you how the machines are working, how people are responding, and whether people are staying through and coming through. So I'll just give a couple examples of the work we're doing. One of the projects we're working on right now in Senegal and Cameroon is around UTI testing. And they wanted to introduce 2 diagnostic tests for UTIs to better manage them. So one is a lateral flow test at the point of care. And then the second one is a near point of care blood test that would help to differentiate between the different bacteria that may be causing UTI. This would allow, of course, for better use of antibiotics and life-saving, because there's actually a surprising mortality rate, and it's a very difficult condition to manage. Again, why do we need an AI and a digital tool? And I think here, I think UTI is a great use case because, speaking to a lot of doctors, UTIs is like the thing you learn in the second week of medical school, right? Syndromic management, you look at it, you think, okay, that's probably a UTI, you prescribe an antibiotic, and you say, if it doesn't work, come back in 7 days. And that sort of everybody knows issue is part of the problem, right? That's why we're having so much antimicrobial resistance. That's why we're having poor outcomes. But to introduce a diagnostic test now into that requires a lot of behavior change. Patients think, why would I need a diagnostic test? The providers are not used to doing diagnostic tests at this point. And because we're introducing new tools, of course, we need to submit it. We need to do CE marking. We need to submit it to WHO PQ. We need to look at all these other issues. So we need really high quality data. We need people to do behavior change. We need them to understand a new and novel diagnostic process, how to interpret the results, and all these sorts of things. So that's a platform, and our platform helps with those sorts of things, right? So communicate to the patient, communicate with the provider, help walk them through using the tools, collecting data from the tools, and making sure that all of that comes out into high quality data, regulatory grade data that can be used to sort of set policies and approve new diagnostics. Another one that we've been working on and we're testing, we're using now in Eswatini, is HIV testing, HIV self-testing. And this one I like to speak about just from the human-centered design aspect and how important it is to make sure that these digital and AI tools aren't foisted upon people, that they are meant, and this is why I always talk about how important it is to understand why we're doing this, right? And if what we're doing is to try and make it better for overstretched health workers, then it better be better for them, right? It's got to take away their work. It's got to make it simpler and easier and faster. And we've got to understand how patients actually interact and what do they actually need to know and when do they need to know it. So we put together this platform here to support HIV self-testing. This could be, you can order tests to your home, and we've seen some of that. Actually, what was interesting to me was how much people didn't want to have tests delivered to their homes. What they preferred to do, as home is not as private as people think, they actually would prefer to go to a booth somewhere, it could be at a pharmacy or a mall, or on their way home, go in, get a self-test, walk through the self-test, and then head out, because that's actually the most convenient thing. So that's what we're doing. It's super interesting. And then there's lots of work in there about how do you make that valuable? How do you get people to report? If people are positive, how are you going to link them to care? How are you going to make sure that they're saying this? And there's lots of other information we can gather and push people towards prophylaxis and other things. Because remember, the diagnostic test is an important test or screening, but there's lots you could do with that information too, whether if they're positive or they're negative. I mean, obviously we think about the positives a lot. Okay, now we have a positive. What are we going to do? How do we make sure that they get to care? How do we make sure that they take the appropriate next steps? But sometimes it's just as important to say, well, if they're negative and they are at risk, how do we get them back to retest in 6 months or now, or what else can we do to help them to move through? So that's why we're putting this together. Just to come back to the initial question here of like, what should we be doing in Africa? How should we be promoting these tools? How should we be using point of care diagnostics? And I want to just point to what I see as really the great advantages we have in Africa. The biological environmental diversity, the fantastic scientific institutions we have that know how to work in this diversity, that are frugal, they understand, frugal innovation and how to make things that really work in a cost competitive way. And, we're not doing manufacturing really, and we're not really cost competitive, but Africans can be. I mean, we're young, we've got all of the capabilities, we just need to start building this out. And I point to all this because I think it's really important to understand what it is that we could be doing to provide this. And I really think that point of care diagnostics could be a real, a really valuable thing that Africa could provide to the world. There's, like I said right from the start, there is not enough money. There's not enough health workers. This is a problem not just in Africa. This is a problem everywhere in the world. But I do think that Africans could really come up with great solutions that could be purchased everywhere in the world. And if we can get better tests and we can use that lab data we have and we can have good tests and they can be supported, integrated tests, then we have something that we could actually trade with, right? And we can be paying for the AI that's going to be coming in, but we could be trading it with rapid tests for Ebola or measles or Rift Valley fever or point of care diagnostics. And I think this is where I'd like to see us go, is not thinking so much about, okay, how do I build more AI tools that are going to compete with American tools? they're probably not. Americans are going to be able to build the same tool you're going to build in no time. What they can't build is that real knowledge of how to deliver it and how to deliver things that really matter, and deliver that from Africa at great prices that can actually improve health efficiently and effectively. So that's a little bit of just why I think we want to talk about this, some of our experience, lots of great partners that have helped us on the way out here, and I cede the rest of my time, as they say.
All right. Thanks, Luke, for sharing the experience of Aviro Health. Thanks for the use cases, and I think the high level takeaways. The need to pay attention to the context, the realities in low and middle income countries. We're talking about AI tools that consume lots of electricity, bandwidth, which might not be available, but there have been creative ways that organizations and researchers and companies and startups have been able to, for example, provide access to large language models via ordinary telephone calls, where the processing is done somewhere else where there might be internet electricity, but people can access that via telephone calls. So there's this creativity, and the idea of frugal innovation allows people to come up with creative ways, but also to come up with solutions that are more affordable, and that is important, and that can also be a reverse innovation. So yes, thank you. And Luke has talked about the experience and giving this at let's say a high level. The two speakers who are coming up are Ainekirabo, Mbabazi, and Qianyi, who are going to be talking about the use of these very tools and these approaches in HoliCare. So Qianyi is also working with us in the HoliCare consortium, and Qianyi is a quality assurance and regulatory affairs and clinical scientist at GADx, with a strong background in development and optimization of rapid diagnostic tests. She has extensive experience in biomarker and antibody screening, conjugation chemistry, and lateral flow assays, which is one of the technologies that we are using in HoliCare. And in her current role, she supports HoliCare clinical trial, overseeing participant safety, data quality, and overall trial integrity. And as I mentioned, we are currently testing these innovative technologies in Uganda, Ethiopia, and in Senegal. And Qianyi will be speaking about some of that work and the digital solutions that are being used, including a mobile app that is AI enabled. So Qianyi, if you can project your slides and take it away, and then Ainekirabo will come later on.
Okay. Okay. Can you see the slides okay?
Yes.
Right, great. So today my topic, well, hello everyone. And my topic is on combining the lateral flow testing with reader technology in the HoliCare clinical trial. So let me just check that it's sharing. It's going to go to the next page. Great. So I start by giving the background on the ongoing HoliCare study. Then I'll be going through the app and its interface used in this study. I will also talk about the user experiences in the field, as well as the benefits of combining this piece of technology with lateral flow testing. I'll finish with a discussion on how this can be useful beyond the clinical study. So first of all, in terms of background, the HoliCare clinical study that's currently happening in 3 sub-Saharan African countries, Senegal, Uganda, and Ethiopia. It aims to evaluate 2 innovative diagnostic tests for upper and lower respiratory tract infections. And one of the sub-studies, so sub-study 1, evaluates a set of lateral flow tests designed by GADx, so the company that I work at. It detects flu, COVID, and RSV on 2 separate strips. It's a 20-minute test, and so the kind of flow of things is that when the patient comes in, if they are diagnosed with upper respiratory tract infection and they consent to taking part in the study, the clinician then takes 2 nasopharyngeal swab samples from them and test on the lateral flows. Once the 20 minutes up, the clinician reads this result by eye record this in a database called REDCap, which I'm sure Mbabazi is going to talk about later. But they also use the HoliCare Reader app, which is a software app developed by iStock from Finland. It can be used on a tablet or a mobile phone running Android system to scan the device. The app then decides if the result is positive or negative. And this, along with the image that's captured of the device, is uploaded to a cloud service, and from there pushed to REDCap to a corresponding patient ID. So you can, next I'm going to go through the HoliCare app interface. So from left to right, there are some examples of what the user sees on the app. First, we've got the login page. Each user is given a unique user account. There is controlled access to data groups for the study, so the data collectors can only see patients from their sites. So this is one of the measures to protect patient confidentiality for the purpose of the trial. Next one, we have the homepage, which kind of gives the user access to creation of new scans. They can also look at past patient data. They can train themselves by going through a tutorial, and it also gives them a status for internet connection to the cloud. And then we have adding personal information as well as selecting test types for the two other interfaces. When the app is, so this is just an example of what the tutorial looks like for the users. If they need to have any additional training, they can go through this animation and tells them exactly what to do. So when the user is using the app to scan the devices, the app checks that the app camera is level, the device orientation is correct, which means that sample well is on the right-hand side, as you can see from this photo, and there is sufficient lighting to identify the test lines before taking the picture. The result is then given on the next step. It will ask the clinician to confirm and, if needed, retake the picture. They also have the option to manually select the result before submitting it to the cloud. So at the start of recruitment, we did see some users were making slight mistakes when reading or entering a result, and it was quickly picked up by us reviewing the photos. So we could provide training when and where appropriate. While this approach does require additional effort from data collectors on site and from the clinical monitoring team at GADx, since every image must be verified against the corresponding result recorded in REDCap, it was providing greater confidence in the data that we've collected, and it's essential for ensuring high data quality and integrity. So a little bit more about REDCap ahead of Mbabazi. The app itself is actually optimized with the location with the study sites in mind. We anticipated that with some of the clinical sites, particularly those in rural areas, there might always be reliable internet access. And I think Uganda actually had a week where they had no internet access during the presidential elections. So to address potential connectivity issues, the app could be accessed and used entirely offline when capturing the test images and reading test results and storing them on a device indefinitely. And for the purpose of study, the data is synced to the cloud when the user logs off and whenever internet access becomes available. In addition to this, the images captured were resized by the app automatically to about 15 kilobytes or less. To put that into perspective, it's about 100 times less than a standard photo taken on a phone. So the app is able to maintain sufficient image quality, and we could read the images after long after they were taken, and we could see what the test line intensities were, and we could have a clear idea of the patient ID, which is also written on the test. So this function actually ensures that the data collection remains uninterrupted and secure, regardless of local connectivity challenges, while preserving the quality and completeness of studied data across all sites. Whereas on the REDCap platform, so you can see on the left-hand side, that's a screenshot of an example of data captured on REDCap, the test information like lateral flow test result, time was taken, and the team member responsible for this test are recorded. Now we're going to move on to benefits and user experiences. So from the perspective of a diagnostic company that made these lateral flows, having images of device prototypes used in the field actually provides valuable insights into test performance. It allows assessment of how well the sample and detection particles migrate across the read window. It gives us feedback on particle stability over time and ideas of how the users have performed the test, so a bit of an extra usability study for us. It helps build a clearer understanding of how the assay perform in real-world settings in Africa, which in turn feeds into optimization and development of future assays. Whereas for the clinical study, so documentation of source data is necessary for the reconstruction and validation of clinical findings. As for the teams collecting data across Uganda, Ethiopia, and Senegal, we've actually gathered some feedback from their experiences using the app. I'm glad to say it's been positive generally, and they felt that there was a bit of learning curve at the start, but have quickly learned that having a well-lit environment was the key for getting through the app's quality check. In initial weeks, there was a lot of communication between ourselves at GADx, with iStock and the teams at the clinical sites. And there was issues, obviously, at the start, like data mismatching to the patient ID or incorrect app result interpretation, but these were quickly identified and resolved. So one thing I find was quite interesting was that the app's algorithm meant that it looks for a certain characteristic on the device to locate the read window and then the control line, the test line. For this study, we did ask the sites to write the patient IDs on top of the devices, but what we have found was that it can sometimes get misinterpreted by the app when the pen mark is very close to the edge of the read window, and it was given invalid or false positive results when there isn't a test line. So after identifying this issue, we have asked the sites to write them away from the read window as the sort of quickest way of resolving the issue. But we know that in the real world situation, the patient may not even be writing this on the tests. It was still really useful to see and kind of show the range of photos that may be needed in the training process of a successful algorithm in the field. So going beyond the study, when we look beyond the study, it still holds true that in rural areas of LMIC countries where healthcare resources are scarce and access to medical professionals is often limited, patients can benefit significantly from simple and affordable rapid testing. However, the interpretation of test results can sometimes be challenging for lay people and especially those with impaired vision. But when combined with the lateral flows, apps like the HoliCare app can become highly powerful tools in healthcare delivery because they provide patients with accurate and unbiased result interpretation without having to wait several days for laboratory-based testing. So these technologies could enable more frequent testing and wider population screening while reducing the time spent on manual data entry and data cleaning. But beyond infectious diseases, this approach may also support the management of chronic disease and NCDs by identifying patterns indicating disease exacerbation or monitoring patient recovery over a period of at-home testing. There are, of course, barriers like lower literacy levels, limited smartphone adoption, and the associated cost, which restricts the personal use of app-based rapid tests. But smartphone adoption is fortunately on the rise, and in sub-Saharan Africa, it was just over 50% in 2024, according to a study. And it's now projected that by 2030, this will increase to about 80%. And with increased network speed, it will make access possible for the wider population. So this is all from me today. I think the future is looking bright for Africa, and I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end. Over to you, Johnblack.
Thank you so much, Qianyi, for these important highlights of how you're using it, how you are implementing. I think the points about user testing are extremely important. Luke also mentioned at the beginning of his presentation that we need to make sure that these tools are used as intended, and we need to see that people are trained. We need to observe. There usually some assumptions that we make. For example, people might want to use solutions for self-testing at home, but you find out that actually people prefer to get this from a booth. Same might happen when you give them a tool for using a smartphone app to self-test, but they might not use it in the way that you intended. If it is to do with where they write that the notes or the name, and then that causes a false reading, that can be a problem. So training and testing with users is important. We know this whole concept of user-centered design and participatory design. So I think that's something that you highlighted quite well. Before I bring Ainekirabo to speak, there's some questions have been put in the chat, and if you want, Qianyi and Luke, you can actually answer them. I'll answer the first one that came in that is asking about physical training. And yes, we do have some physical training in the HoliCare consortium, but even better, we have the HoliCare Academy, and my colleague will put a link in the chat so that you can sign up for the HoliCare Academy and you can find all the resources about these innovations, the architecture behind them, the trainings that have been given. But we also hold physical trainings in country, in Uganda and Ethiopia. We've already done those. And we've also done, we'll be doing one in Senegal, where we're doing the trials now to demonstrate these innovations and even getting some results from the clinical trial. So that's about training, but there's a few other questions that we'll get to later. And the Academy is free, and all these discussions and recordings are posted there. So for now, we'll go over to the next speaker, Ainekirabo Mbabazi, who is a software engineer from Makerere University in Uganda. She specializes in clinical research technology and scalable backend solutions. And for our HoliCare project, she architected the HoliCare REDCap platform, which allows data to move between the 3 countries where we're doing the clinical trials, that is Uganda, Senegal, and Ethiopia. But she has also done work on other technologies, for example, in agriculture and HR management.
Thank you very much, Johnblack. So for today's presentation, I'll basically talk about the customizations that we have done in order to support the clinical trials in the 3 countries. And the agenda will be as follows. You can proceed to the next slide. All right, sure. So we will go through the overview. Then we'll talk about the core functionalities that are supported. Then we'll discuss the system architecture, and then we will have the workflow layout from enrollment to biobanking. And then we'll talk about the different integrations that are currently supported. Then we'll talk about the current data quality framework in place. Then I'll also talk about the regulatory compliances that we adhere to. And then also we'll have the presentation on the use cases and then the user personas. Then we'll have the current performance metrics. And then we'll have a visualization of how the different sites are distributed and the current data that we have at the moment. And then we'll end our discussion with the lessons learned. Okay, so at the glance, what HoliCare is doing, just like the previous speakers mentioned, is that they are trying to validate a novel diagnostic tools, and these are two in particular. There's the LFT one, and then there's also the point of care instrument. And this is being done across 3 countries, and that is Uganda, Senegal, and Ethiopia. We have so far enrolled over 2,000 patients. And then we have 11 hospitals. So you'll see hospitals and sites used interchangeably throughout the slide. And then we've been able to train over 67 users at the moment. And we are evaluating the 2 innovative tools that our previous speakers mentioned about. Next slide, please. So the core functionalities that we have at the moment include the clinical trial data capture, which captures the patient eligibility, the demographics, the symptoms, the clinical examinations, diagnoses, and then also the sample collection details. And then we have the microbiology and lab data collection that integrates the results from the LFTs and the PCR validation, and then also the detailed blood culture with the ASTs. Then we have the biobanking data capture, which manages the consent, collection, processing, storage, transportation of various biological samples. And then finally, we have the survey that is supposed to collect the socio-demographic information and detailed participant attitudes and preferences regarding the biobanking. Next slide, please. So the current setup is set up in such a way that we have the data collection layer, which is a collection of different tools, and one is the REDCap itself. And then also we have the LFT reader that Qianyi presented earlier. And then also we have a point of care instrument that is specifically capturing pathogen data for MTB, pneumonia, bronchitis, among other diseases. And then also the LFT tool is specifically for the upper respiratory tract infections. So it is specifically capturing data concerning influenza, COVID, and RSV. And then the REDCap interface is also capturing additional information about the patient, such as the biobanking data, and then also the screening information. So what happens in the application layer is that we have branching logic, because we have different tools, and we have seen that patients, depending on which infection they have, will need to access different interfaces. So in the branching logic, we will determine which particular interfaces the patient or the data entrant is supposed to access based on whether the person has a lower tract infection or an upper tract infection. And then we also have the validation of our rules that are set for this particular trial, and then also real-time calculation of CT values. This is to do with the actual interpretation of results. And then also we have the interpretation of the cassette images to determine whether the person has an infection or not. And then at the storage layer, we have the structured data stored in relational databases, and then the unstructured data, such as the LFTs and the LAMP test reports, stored in the file repository. So for the transmission, we do utilize the REDCap API to be able to transmit data from the LFT mobile reader, and also the point of care instrument that we talked about. So the core system, the specifications are as follows. We are currently using REDCap version 16.1.4, and it's built on top of Python, JavaScript, and SQL. Then the infrastructure, we have a MySQL database, which has, we also have a configuration of the Apache web server. And then also this is, it has a dedicated SSL and HTTPS binding. Then for the security and the access, because you're dealing with different countries, and within those countries, you also have different hospitals. So you need to make sure that you have a way of making sure that one hospital does not access data that belongs to a different hospital. So how we are ensuring that is by implementing a role-based access and also having these different hospitals grouped under what we call data access groups to create a bit of an isolated environment for each site. And then, of course, we have encryption. And then for interoperability, we are able to extract and export data in the following formats. We have the CSV export and the XML alongside the JSON format. And then for the workflow of how everything is coming together, at the point of enrolling a patient, we capture the sites, so they select which site they belong to. Whoever is entering that data has to select the site they belong to. And then based on the site, we will be able to give them different screens because to have their sites in French, whereas the other sites prefer English. So we are basing on that to determine which interfaces they get to access. And then the screening and the e-consent happen almost at the same time. And then from that, we do have the sample tracking where we capture different sample data and the details, and then we track them throughout the process up to the biobanking stage. And then the LFT captures the images that are coming in from the LFT app reader alongside the test results. Then the PCR analysis is basically analyzing the information and the results that we are picking from the point of care instrument. Same happens with the microbiology, and then the final step is the storage, which is the biobanking step itself. Next slide, please. All right, so currently we do have integration with the LFT app reader, which is sending in the LFT images alongside the results. And then also we have the point of care instrument integration that sends in the raw files from the POC instrument. The same thing with the LAMP cycler, which is sending in the custom molecular testing information. So that how we are handling data quality, we do have at the front end validations to ensure that all the required fields are populated. And then also we have brain checkers that make sure that the data that is input does not go beyond what is expected or what is regarded as the standard. And then also the validation formats. Then for the back-end protocol, we are looking at the branching logic, like I had already mentioned, and then also we are looking at the different protocols designed specifically for our study. Then we do have real-time calculations for fields such as the CT values to make sure that we avoid the errors that could be introduced by the human beings doing their own calculations. Then when it comes to the query management, we have a system, a dashboard that will allow the people that are managing this data to query specific elements within the data itself as it's being sent in. So they are able to raise queries, and then the data entrants are able to resolve those queries. Then in terms of compliance, on the national level, we are compliant to the DPPA 2019, the DPO, and the UNCST guidelines, then also the Electronic Acts 2011, the Public Health Act, and then for the international standards, we are compliant with HIPAA, ISO 14155, and then the ICH, GCP, E6R2, and then also the GDPR compliance. Then at the institutional level, since our deployment is deployed at the Infectious Disease Institute, we are compliant to their data privacy policy and then also to their data sharing policy alongside the information security policy. So for our deployment, we do, as I already mentioned, the key concepts that we are looking at are studies that are multi-site. So we are able to handle multi-site trials, which helps us to be able to track how data is being entered across different geographical locations, and then also ensure that those different sites are able to access partition data in real time. And then also we do the lab and the diagnostic data, which is basically an integration or an aggregation of the point of care test results and the automated PCR analysis alongside with the microbiology data into a patient record. So you find that it's an aggregation of 3 different tools that are all supposed to add up together to create the patient record. And then for the biobanking, we do store biological samples for future tests or for future experiments. And in this cycle, what we are handling or what we are covering is the storage and the transportation conditions in which this data is captured or stored. So then for the surveys, what we are giving is the patient demographics, the attitudes, the outcomes of these particular participants who participated in the study. So yeah, we do give that particular use case in order for them to be able to track that. And so the current users of the tool are the lab technicians who handle the sample reception and processing, and then also do diagnostic test entry alongside specimen storage management. Then the PI is able to know and monitor the progress of the study, and then also check for data quality, and then also export site level reports. And then the data manager is able to access centralized data, and then also cross-site consistency checks to ensure that they are conforming to the protocols that are set up for the study. Then the site admin is able to set up the user accounts and also set up the data access groups for the different sites that are participating in the study, and then also do security and patch deployments alongside backing up and disaster recovery activities. Then the participant provides us with a consent, and then also they complete the survey for biobanking. Then finally, the clinical research coordinator is able to do patient screening and enrollment, informed consent management, and also have offline clinical data entry, since we identified in the previous presentations that having an offline fast system is really important for this study. So we do have support for offline data capture, and then the data syncs once there's access to connectivity. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms of performance, the data has so far been at least over 98% complete, and the system has been up 99% of the time because of the offline first design that we had at the very start. And then data, you're able to synchronize data within 5 minutes of connectivity. And then we already have 67 plus users that have already been trained, and these are ranging across clinical, lab, and data management roles in the 3 countries. And we so far have this deployed in low connectivity settings, like the previous presenters said. And then also we have daily increments for our backups and weekly full backups. So in terms of the distribution of the sites, we have enrolled 5 sites in Ethiopia, and of these 5 sites, we have 932 people that have already been screened, and of the screened people, 871 have been eligible for the study, and the goal initially was to hit 270. So we've already exceeded our target in Ethiopia. Then in Uganda, we have 3 sites, and in the 3 sites, we have screened 772, 617 were eligible, and 720 was our target. So still in this case, we can already see that we are getting very close to the target. And then for Senegal came in a little bit later. So for the statistics are still low, but we know that by the end of this project, we will be able to hit our desired targets. Next slide, please. So for the lessons learned, here are our key takeaways: that a mobile first and offline system is a non-negotiable, especially if you are working in a low connectivity setting, and that data must continue seamlessly without internet. So synchronizing this data should happen once there's connectivity. So that means if you're to operate in a setting such as we are, you need to make sure that you think about how you're going to capture this data offline, because the internet is really not reliable. And then partitioned access, especially if you're running a multi-site trial, you do not want sites from one country accessing data from a different country. And then, of course, because we have sites that are participating and not all of them are using a single language, it's important for us to think about translation when we are building the tools that we are to use in these settings. So localization is very important and is key. And then also you also need to understand the workflows, because different settings have different workflows. What might work for one site might not really work for the next. Then the API integrations should always be thought about in such a way that they allow retrying multiple times, because if you do not think about the workflow that allows for a system to do retries, in case of a network issue, you might lose data along the way. So it's important for you to think about that. And then for the quality and the engagement, it is important to have data quality inbuilt within the process itself, so that you give users feedback and you also, they are able to update the data as you go, so that you do not have to wait for the project to end and then you go through the entire data repository, identifying errors that could perhaps not be corrected at the time. Then we design for scalability, because these trials or these systems will be implemented in, and we've seen adoption of AI tools. So it's important for us to have that in mind, that you could have more users than you currently anticipated, and we should be able to scale as the users or the user base grows. Yeah, that's basically it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mbabazi, and thank you to all the the speakers, the presenters. I know that we've gone a bit over time, but this is an interesting discussion that covers a wide range of things. I think Mbabazi began with a, let's say, technologically heavy presentation, but I would say that it is necessary to understand that you need multiple components that need to work together, and you have to consider those things to do with security. Data access are always important issues that we have to think about. So yeah, that's a very good presentation, and I think there's a couple of takeaways. But we want to address some questions that people have raised, and if you have a question, you can still put it in the chat. If you need to drop off, I know that we've gone past the hour, but we want to answer these questions that have been raised before we conclude the webinar. But there has been a couple of questions that I think the presenters can talk about. So there is one from Winfred, who is asking about access to the community and asking how we've been approaching this. And I see that Luke has given a good response to that. There's been a recurring theme of how to make sure that the tools are contextualized with language translation, with offline capabilities, with simple tools that can users can use without need for fancy infrastructure. So all of these are ways of making sure that things are available. And this is also really what we are doing in HoliCare, to have what we call point of care connected diagnostics. So I think that has been covered. There's been also a question about offline capability, especially if you have AI models that need to usually to connect to a server somewhere, and I think that has also been covered there. Yeah, so I think maybe to conclude, what I want to say is that we have a lot of information about HoliCare. The link has been shared. You can find more information on our website, and you can also join the Academy and find the previous recordings and other resources, including literature and publications that are related to this project. And I think all the questions in the chat have been answered. I don't see any new ones. I would like to thank you for joining us today and for participating in this webinar. And we would like to thank all the collaborators that are contributing to HoliCare. And with that, we would like to wish you a good afternoon.